Get out of here." These cold words were uttered by my mother-in-law, Grace, as soon as my husband's overseas assignment was confirmed. She kicked me and my daughter out of the house. With nowhere to live, I took my 2-year-old daughter to the park. As I was overwhelmed thinking about what to do next, I was suddenly surrounded by police officers. "Please come with us to the station." Trembling in the pouring rain, I followed the officer's instructions and headed to the police station. There, an unexpected person was waiting. "My name is Olive. I turned 35 this year. I met my husband, Jim, at work, and we got married a year after we started dating. I quit my job when we got married, and 2 years ago, I gave birth to our daughter, Tracy. Currently, I live with Jim, Tracy, and my mother-in-law, Grace. We originally lived in a rental property, but when my father-in-law passed away and Grace's knee condition worsened, we decided to live together and bought a new apartment. We considered buying a house, but given Grace's knee condition, a location with good transportation was deemed best. Apartments are less expensive than houses, and life with an elevator became easier, so Grace agreed with this choice. As a result, we made a down payment and took out a 35-year mortgage. Jim's company is known for its frequent business trips and transfers, but we were told that there would be no relocation for the time being since we had recently bought the house. However, Jim's frequency of business trips is high compared to other employees, and he travels to other states once a week. I am raising a 2-year-old daughter, and honestly, it gets stressful when Jim goes on business trips. Initially, Grace was cooperative, but now she hardly helps with child care and instead adds more trouble. For example, she leaves dishes on the table after meals or leaves cooking utensils unsoaked. I'm busy taking care of Tracy, and before I know it, rice grains are stuck to the dishes, making them difficult to clean. When I ask Grace to at least soak the dishes in water, she says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'll be more careful next time." However, she doesn't actually follow through. Strangely, when Jim is home, Grace does soak the dishes properly. I only recently noticed this because there were occasional times when she would soak the dishes, so I thought it was fine. But now my thinking has changed. Grace is likely harassing me on purpose. Also, when going shopping, if I ask, "Do you need anything?" she responds, "No, I don't need anything special right now." But when I get home, she says, "Actually, I need something for tomorrow's hospital visit." This doesn't happen just occasionally, it's quite frequent. Grace has bad knees, and moving is difficult for her, so I wanted to support her as much as possible, but lately my willingness to help has been waning. I've considered discussing this issue with Jim. However, considering how busy he is with work, I feel reluctant to burden him further. Grace's harassment began not long after we started living together and has been going on for several years. When I confided in a friend about this issue, she advised, "That sounds like typical mother-in-law bullying. If it's tough, why don't you talk to your husband? He might be able to do something." I was concerned that if I brought up the issue with Jim, the lonely Grace might end up in a facility. Initially, I thought enduring this might be better for Grace. However, a certain event later changed my mind. That day, I was supposed to leave Tracy at my parents' house. My parents adore Tracy and sometimes have her stay over. "Thank you. We always look forward to you bringing Tracy over." "Really? That's true. Why don't you stay over too, Olive?" "I'd love to stay, but I'm worried about leaving Grace alone, so I'll go home today. I'll come to pick her up tomorrow. Please don't buy her too many toys." After a delightful time, I decided to head back to the apartment where Grace was. Upon returning to the apartment, I realized something significant. I had forgotten the house keys. Despite forgetting the keys, I assumed Grace was at home, so I decided to use the intercom to call her. I entered the apartment number and called, but there was no response. Maybe she's gone out. With that thought, I decided to wait outside the building for a while. However, there was no sign of Grace returning. About 2 hours passed. It was after 7:00 p.m., and it had become completely dark outside. Fortunately, I saw other residents returning home, so I waited for the auto lock to open and followed them into the entrance. It was rare for Grace to go out late at night, so I was certain she must be at home. I pressed the room intercom again. The intercom rang, but still there was no response. After waiting at the door for a while, I heard a click from inside. That sound meant Grace must be inside. I pressed the intercom several times, but Grace did not respond in the end. Eventually, I spent the night at a nearby business hotel and decided to return home the next day when Jim came back from his business trip. "Oh, what happened? Did you go shopping?" Actually, that's when I decided to confess to Jim that I had been kicked out of the house by Grace. Jim was angry on my behalf, but Grace, pretending to be hard of hearing, said, "Oh, is that so?" I couldn't hear very well, while seemingly trying to suppress a laugh. Finally, after entering the house, I took the keys and went to pick up Tracy, who was staying with my parents. When I explained the situation to my parents, they said, "That's clearly harassment. If it gets too tough, you can always come back home." "Really, you can always come back to us," my parents said, offering words of encouragement. I couldn't help but tear up at my parents' words, but since Tracy was there, I quickly wiped away the tears and returned home. For a while after that, there was no harassment from Grace. However, the peaceful days didn't last long as suddenly Jim's overseas transfer was decided. A transfer? Isn't it just a business trip? Yeah, I can't believe it's an overseas transfer just after we bought the house. What should we do? I think it's better for you and Tracy to stay in the U.S., but can you get along with Mom? I couldn't answer Jim's question immediately. However, considering that living abroad could be stressful for Tracy, I decided that my daughter and I should stay in the U.S. Shortly after the overseas transfer was confirmed, Jim departed for Japan. He was worried about us, but perhaps because he was busy with work, he didn't have much time to think about us. And so a new life began for Tracy, Grace, and me. As expected, living with Grace did not go smoothly. Her attitude changed completely right after Jim left. On that day, a hurricane was approaching, and it was raining heavily outside. It was a dangerous downpour that made it difficult to go outside. Amidst this, Grace made an unbelievable suggestion. "Now that Jim has gone overseas, could you please leave this place?" "What do you mean?" "Just that. I will take over this house, so you don't need to stay here anymore. I can't relax with other people around. Please leave soon." I was shocked and doubted my ears. Indeed, we are not related by blood, but I had tried my best to live comfortably with each other, and I had treated myself as a member of the family. However, perhaps to Grace, we were just insignificant. "As time is passing while we talk, please leave quickly." Urged by her, Tracy and I were hastily kicked out of the house. No matter how many times I knocked on the door, Grace did not respond, desperate and holding Tracy tight. I walked to the nearby park in the pouring rain. The park had a roof, so I thought it might provide some shelter from the rain. Ideally, staying at a business hotel or going back to my parents' house would be best, but I had left my wallet and smartphone at home. Sitting in the park, I deeply contemplated what to do next. I had no idea how much time had passed in the torrential rain. Amid the freezing cold, sleepiness began to overtake me. The sky was getting darker, and despite it being summer, I feared I might catch a cold if things continued this way. The situation was dire, but I had no choice but to walk to my parents' house. However, it would take about 3 hours on foot to get there. As I pondered what to do, I saw 2 lights approaching from a distance. Thinking that asking for help might resolve the situation, I was about to call out when a police officer spoke to me first. "Are you Olive, and is this your daughter Tracy?" Surprised that the police officer knew my name, I weakly responded, "Yes, that's correct." The officer said, "Could you please come to the station?" I wondered why I needed to go to the police station, but it seemed there was a reason. Following the officer's urging, I got into the patrol car. Tracy and I were shivering from being out in the rain for a long time, but the officer had prepared large towels for us. "These might not be enough, but please use them. We have clothes for you to change into once we get to the station." He kindly handled the situation. Wondering why the police knew about me and why we were being taken to the station, I asked, "Why do we need to go to the station?" He replied, "I'll explain the details once we get to the station. Please rest for now." Hearing this and reaching my limit of fatigue, I realized upon waking that we had already arrived at the station. Following the officer inside, I saw Grace and my uncle there. "Uncle, why are you here?" "Jim asked me to. He was worried that Grace might be giving you a hard time while he's abroad, so he asked me to keep an eye on things." According to my uncle, Jim had been concerned about this issue for a while and, unable to address it from overseas, had asked him to monitor the situation. Today, after spotting me in the rain, my uncle deemed the situation abnormal and called the police. My uncle informed the police of our location, and they came to pick us up. Grace was also asked to come to the police station. Sitting on the sofa, Grace looked at us unhappily. "Why do I need to be here? My knees are bad." "None of this would have happened if Jim were here," she complained, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Grace had her perspective, but this was something Jim had arranged through my uncle. After consulting with the police, it was determined that the incident could have legal implications. The suggestion that a lawyer should be hired was also raised. "A lawyer? Isn't that a bit much? All I did was lock the door. I didn't do anything else." "Do you really understand the severity of what you've done? You threw out Olive and her young child into a torrential rain. That's not acceptable." My uncle stood up for us. He then revealed, "Actually, Olive is the owner of the house." "That can't be right. Jim, the head of the house, is the owner. Now that Jim is gone, I'm the owner." Grace still believed Jim was the owner, but that wasn't the case. In fact, my uncle deals in real estate, and through his connections, we were able to buy the apartment at a good price. Because it was a transaction among relatives, Jim had advised that the property be put in my name. Initially, I didn't mind either way, but now I'm grateful for Jim's suggestion. Afterward, I hired a lawyer introduced by my uncle to proceed with consultations. According to the lawyer, it would be difficult to make Grace leave. Therefore, if we need to distance ourselves from Grace in the future, the best advice was to place her in a facility. Having learned this, I immediately called Jim to explain the situation. Jim had not expected the situation to escalate this far and said he would return to the U.S. to discuss it thoroughly. He is also considering the possibility of placing Grace in a facility. Meanwhile, for some reason, Grace was inside the police station, concerned only with eating donuts. Since we cannot continue living with Grace, Tracy and I decided to temporarily take refuge at my parents' house until Jim returns. Jim will return from Japan in a week, so we need to decide our next steps during that time. If Jim does not support me, divorce may become one of the options. During this time, I regretted not sharing the problem sooner. 1 week later, Jim returned from Japan. Since he was at home with Grace, I moved back from my parents' house to our home. Jim had to return to Japan urgently, so he could only stay in the U.S. for a few days. During the short time, we needed to discuss what to do. "I heard from Uncle, but is that really true?" "That's not true at all. It's all made up. I haven't done anything, and Olive is trying to get rid of me. Grace did not want to admit any fault and accused me of trying to oust her. Jim seemed to be listening to Grace's side while considering my position. Understood, but do you have any concrete evidence that Olive is trying to do something? Evidence? There's no such thing. I see. Do you have any evidence, Olive? Honestly, I haven't been very attentive to the family because of my work. That's why I can't immediately believe anyone's words. I'm sorry to say that. I handed him something. What is this? What I handed to him was a voice recorder that I always carry with me. I had been recording Grace's remarks on this voice recorder on a regular basis. Not only the incident when she kicked me out, but also her usual verbal abuse was recorded on it. When Jim played the voice recorder, Grace's voice came through saying, "Truly a useless daughter-in-law. Why did Jim ever marry such a woman?" Hearing this, Grace hurriedly began to make excuses. This is different. Doesn't everyone get irritated sometimes? I was just in a bad mood at that moment. That's all it was. Grace claimed this, but the voice recorder continued to play more of her abusive language. There were so many instances of abuse that not all of them had been recorded. As the audio played, Jim's hands were shaking as he held the voice recorder. Grace had a clearly disturbed expression on her face. "Mom, what is all this about?" Despite hearing Jim's question, Grace remained silent. "Your silence means you admit this is true, right? Then I have a responsibility to protect Olive and Tracy. You understand that, don't you?" I had never seen Jim angry before. Confronted with Jim's anger, Grace was frightened and stood there speechless. Before Jim returned to the U.S., several discussions took place. I firmly argued that it was impossible for me to live with Grace in the future. I couldn't bear the possibility of such situations happening again, especially not with Tracy's safety at stake. Jim agreed on this point and considered placing Grace in a facility. However, Grace strongly objected to being placed in a facility, and the discussions were difficult. "That's fine, but I've decided to sell the house. So you can't live here. If you don't go to the facility, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. How dare you decide this on your own? I won't allow you to sell the house." Grace was opposed to selling the house, but it was an unacceptable demand. This was because Tracy and I had decided to move with Jim to Japan. Jim regretted not having spent enough time with his family and promised to value our time together more from now on. Although there was some resistance to living abroad, having Jim by our side provided a sense of security. Moreover, for Tracy, who is only 2 years old, it would be a great opportunity to learn a new language in a new environment. Therefore, we had no choice but to sell the apartment, which still had a mortgage remaining. We could have kept it, but I couldn't leave the mortgage payments to Grace. She was living on a pension, and considering her future needs, she thought she needed someone else's support. Grace was not convinced until the end, but we decided to place her in a facility almost forcibly. Jim said, "I'm sorry, but I need to return to Japan. Could you handle the procedure in the U.S.?" And then he went back to Japan. With support from those around me, I completed the procedures to place Grace in the facility. Grace regularly receives updates from the facility, but she seems to be quite down. Not only is she lacking energy, but she also tends to cause trouble with other residents, making things complicated. Before heading to Japan, I visited the facility to see Grace, and she vehemently criticized me, saying, "I can't forgive you for locking me up in a place like this." She also continuously complained to the staff. "This food is inedible. Serve something decent. The portions are too small. The bed is uncomfortable, and the treatment from others is terrible. Staying here will drive me insane." When I apologized to the staff, they reassured me. "It's okay. These kinds of reactions are common, and there's no need to worry. Please leave her care to us. We will keep you updated regularly, and if there is any need, we will contact you immediately. The staff were extremely kind. Despite the hardships I faced with Grace, I felt some affection for her due to our past life together, and it was with concern that I departed for Japan. Upon arriving in Japan, Jim, who was waiting at the airport, and I went to the apartment we had rented. Living costs in Japan are said to be high, but thanks to a housing allowance from Jim's company, we were able to find a reasonably spacious and affordable apartment. The residents of the apartment are very friendly and have been kind to me despite my limited Japanese. Yesterday, a neighbor shared some homemade beef and potato stew with me, so in return, I gave them some mac and cheese that I cooked. Mac and cheese is not very well known in Japan, but it seems they really liked it. Tracy and I are gradually learning Japanese. Since self-study has its limits, we are also attending a language school. There are many other American people at the school, including many who have just arrived in Japan. I've made new friends there, and I'm enjoying life in Japan. Now that I no longer need to worry about Grace, I can fully enjoy meals out with friends, which was difficult before. While I am slowly getting used to our new life, I won't be completely at ease until Tracy starts kindergarten. In Japan, children generally start kindergarten at the age of 3, so I hope to have her learn Japanese by then. Fortunately, Tracy has a good learning ability and is gradually picking up Japanese. By the time Tracy starts kindergarten, I am also hoping to start working. Jim has said he's fine with me being a stay-at-home mom, but through our new life in Japan, I've been inspired to further myself. Living amidst Japan's rich culture has boosted my self-esteem and made me want to discover new aspects of myself. I've become friends with the staff at a local cafe, and they've invited me to work with them. The cafe is popular with American customers, but many local patrons are also studying English. Life in Japan might still present challenges, but Jim has become more proactive in communication. I'd also become better at expressing my own opinions, and I believe we can overcome any difficulties as a family. Currently, I feel the happiest I've ever been in my life.